This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 766 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. 2 years ago, on almost this exact same date, I did an episode on the impact that mobile quarterbacks have on their teammates in fantasy football. And with more and more of an emphasis on dual-threat quarterbacks in fantasy, I thought it would be a good idea to run it back. The question today is simple. How do mobile quarterbacks impact their teammates in fantasy football? If a running back has a mobile quarterback under center, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing for fantasy purposes? What about at wide receiver and tight end? I'll help answer that question today. Now, before getting into things, I just wanted to send one reminder for you guys to check out lateround.com. Why, you ask? Because over on lateround.com, you can purchase the completed late round prospect guide and you can pre-order the late round draft guide. The prospect guide is all you need for your rookie drafts. The draft guide is everything you need to know for your season-long drafts. The draft guide is currently $19.99 to pre-order, and when it launches on June 30th, that price is going to jump up to $24.99. You can learn more about both guides right now over on lateround.com. Now, I'm not going to be approaching this episode exactly as I did the last one. I like to try to look at things from as many different angles as possible. Here's where I'm going to begin. I looked back to 2011, and I noted every quarterback who had 10 games played while leading his team in pass attempts. That gave me our quarterback population, essentially. If I'm trying to figure out how mobile quarterbacks impact their teammates, I need that quarterback to have actually played for his team, right? So essentially, we have all starting quarterbacks since 2011, the quarterbacks who played the most for their team. I then took all of those quarterbacks and I started bucketing them by the number of rush attempts they had during that season. Starting at 0 rush attempts to 9 rush attempts, that's one bucket. Then 10 to 19, then 20 to 29, and so on. I did that all the way to 150 rush attempts. When I reached 150, I just grouped every quarterback together who had 150 or more rush attempts. And for the record, there were 4 of them. Or 4 seasons where a quarterback had 150 or more rush attempts. Next, I wanted to see general team trends based on those buckets. I was curious to see how team pass attempts and how team pass rates changed from one bucket to the next. Teams with quarterbacks who ran the ball very few times, we'll say 20 or fewer times, they ended up ranking about 13th in pass attempts during that season, on average. And they were about 13th in pass rate too, meaning they were above average in those categories. Their teams threw the ball more than the average team. And that makes sense intuitively. If fewer rush attempts are going to the quarterback, then those plays are probably being converted into pass attempts, or at least some of those plays. Now, as you move down from group to group, pass attempt rank and pass rate rank decreased. For example, in the group of quarterbacks who ran the ball just 20 to 29 times in a given season, their average pass attempt rank was 12.8. Their pass rate rank was 13th. Again, above average numbers. For the group where the quarterback ran the ball 50 to 59 times, so 30 more times across the season versus the previous group, those rankings dropped to about 18th, meaning they were more run heavy on average than the ordinary team. Once I saw these clear trends from group to group, I also noticed something else. There were pretty distinct thresholds where particular drops in pass attempts and pass rates occurred. For example, teams with quarterbacks who ran the ball 0 to 39 times across the season, they had much higher pass rates than the rest of the groups. But teams with quarterbacks who ran the ball 80 or more times, there was another drop in pass rate and pass attempts with that group. That's when I decided that it might be easiest for this podcast to make broader buckets, so I can communicate these ideas a little bit easier. Rather than looking at each of these quarterbacks in groups of 10, I decided to look at 3 distinct groups: the non-runners, the semi-runners, and the definite runners. The non-runners consisted of teams with quarterbacks in that 0 to 39 rush attempt bucket. So their quarterbacks had 0 attempts all the way through 39. The semi-runners consisted of all teams with quarterbacks who ran the ball 40 to 79 times in the season. And then the definite runners consisted of teams with quarterbacks who ran the ball 80 plus times in the season. They were definitely mobile quarterbacks. So this gave us 3 groups that had very different passing profiles. It'll make it easier to follow on the podcast now. Just so you know, the non-runners had an average pass attempt rank of 13.7, meaning of all the teams with quarterbacks who ran the ball 39 or fewer times since 2011, their pass attempt rank in a given season was 13.7. The average would be 16.5 since there are 32 teams in the league. So these teams had above average pass attempt numbers. The semi-runners ranked 17.3 in pass attempts. The definite runners, the guys who ran the ball a ton, their teams ranked 24.5. None of this should be super surprising though, because we know that teams with mobile quarterbacks are generally more run heavy. What might be surprising is what that then means for the personnel on those teams in fantasy football. Let's look at wide receivers and tight ends first. And for the record, all the data that I'll be talking about today is PPR related. But there's an obvious correlation here with wide receivers and tight ends. Teams with more pass attempts would have more targets. Teams with more targets would then have a better chance, more than likely, of scoring fantasy points through the air. And that's what we generally see. The team wide receivers from the non-runner group had an average rank of 14.5 in fantasy points scored. Meaning of all the teams that had a non-runner at quarterback, a guy who was mostly a pocket passer, these teams had a quarterback with fewer than 40 rush attempts across the season. Those teams usually saw their wide receivers score more fantasy points than the average team in football. I'm going to be talking about team scores throughout this podcast. I understand that within that team, a player could have like a 30% target share or something, and he could still be good for fantasy purposes. But we're finding trends first. That's what's most important. Now, for the semi-runner teams, the wide receivers ranked 17.6, so they were slightly below average. And then for the definite runner teams, the average wide receiver rank was 20. They ranked 20th. So the more mobile the quarterback, the fewer points a wide receiver was scoring, or a team of wide receivers. What's interesting is that the numbers weren't as dramatic at tight end. In fact, the best tight end rank came from the semi-runner group. The non-runners had an average tight end rank of 16.2 in fantasy points scored. The semi-runners were at 15.5. So they were scoring more points than the league average. And then the definite runners tight ends, they had an average rank in fantasy points scored of 18.3. So things were a lot tighter. Some may be wondering why that's the case. And my thinking behind that is that if you have a mobile quarterback, you may have less of a need for a tight end to stay on the line to help to block, because you feel more comfortable with the quarterback under pressure. If your quarterback's a statue, you might need all the blocking help that you can get. So overall, wide receivers tend to be impacted more than tight ends with mobile quarterbacks. The more mobile the quarterback, the more rush attempts the quarterback is taking, the fewer fantasy points those positions scored. It's exaggerated more at wide receiver than at tight end. Now, running back is even more interesting in my opinion, because a lot of people don't seem to think that it matters that much, that a mobile quarterback might even help a running back, because that running back becomes more efficient. But historically, mobile quarterbacks have not been good for running backs in fantasy football. If you look at our non-runner quarterback teams, their running backs had an average fantasy points scored rank of 14.9. So once again, these teams were above average at scoring fantasy points compared to a normal team in the league. The semi-runners had a running back points scored rank of 16.6. They were about average. The definite runners had one of 19.8. This data definitely points to running backs not performing as well with mobile quarterbacks. But why? Why is that happening? Wouldn't you assume a mobile quarterback is opening up running lanes for these running backs, allowing them to thrive? Yeah, that's true. Running backs can be more efficient in these offenses. But they're also, number one, scoring fewer touchdowns overall, because the mobile quarterback takes more of those touchdowns. And then number two, and this one's really important, they're seeing a lower target share in their offense. Mobile quarterbacks don't check down to running backs as much. Maybe it's because they can just take off and run with the ball themselves. But team target shares at running back are definitely lower with more mobility at quarterback. For instance, non-running quarterback teams have seen an average running back target share rank of 14.4 since 2011. That jumps up to a rank of 18.1 with the semi-runners, and then it's 21 with the definite runners, 21st. We've had 44 different quarterback seasons within our definite runner sample. So 44 times we've seen a team's lead quarterback hit 80 or more rush attempts. As you'd imagine, there's a lot of repeats in that sample. Players like Lamar Jackson have done this multiple times. So of those 44 instances, we only have 15 unique quarterbacks. So the sample size is not massive. But it's not like we're looking at just one or two quarterbacks here. It's not like one or two of these guys just have this certain tendency to not throw the ball to the running back. And they're skewing this data completely. Okay, now get this. Of those 44 seasons, we had 6 where the team ranked in the top 10 in running back target share. So of those seasons where the quarterback ran the ball a whole lot, only 6 of those seasons saw a top 10 target share rate at running back. 2 of those seasons was Cam Newton throwing the ball to Christian McCaffrey, who's one of the best pass-catching running backs that we've ever seen. One of them was Daniel Jones last year throwing it to Saquon Barkley, who's another good pass catcher, and who played on a team with literally nothing at wide receiver and tight end. One was Tyrod Taylor in 2017. That team had LaShawn McCoy. You know who the number 2 player in receptions was on that team? LaShawn McCoy was number 1. Charles Clay was number 2. You go example by example, and the reason these individual seasons seemed to buck the trend was because there were obvious reasons for them to buck the trend. The fact is, the vast majority of these quarterbacks aren't giving their running backs a juicy target share. And as the rushing volume increases at quarterback, the target share decreases at running back. You can look at this another way too. Among the teams with non-runners at quarterback, 38% of them ended up top 10 in fantasy points scored at running back. That drops to 31% among the semi-runners. And then it's just 13.6% for the definite runners. Literally all 3 positions in fantasy football tend to score fewer fantasy points with mobile quarterbacks. Again, these are just general trends. I'm not even talking about individual players, but individual players will score more fantasy points when their team in general is scoring more fantasy points. And it's because these mobile quarterbacks are gobbling up more of their offense for themselves. Now, like I said, I haven't done this study in a couple of years. Maybe things are changing. Maybe the last 2 seasons have seen dramatically different numbers. I mean, after all, look at Philadelphia. A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, they were all very good in 2022. Not only that, though, but these mobile quarterbacks are becoming better passers. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, they're able to actually sustain production through the air and on the ground. These quarterbacks are doing more than the quarterbacks who ran the ball a lot in like 2014. So let's take a look at a smaller sample size, which is the last 2 years. Let's look at this exact same data. What's very obvious with this new data is that running back has still been pretty rough. Within the group of teams with definite running quarterbacks over the last 2 years, the running backs as a team have ranked almost 21st in fantasy points scored. Their target share rank is almost 22nd. So arguably the running back position has gotten worse for these mobile quarterbacks. At wide receiver, the non-rushing quarterback teams average a wide receiver points ranking of 14.5. Again, well above average. The next group was 17.1, and the definite runners was 18.6. So the number might not be as dramatic, but the trend still exists. The more mobile the quarterback, the fewer fantasy points these wide receivers are scoring. What's interesting about this data, though, is that a higher percentage of teams with definite running quarterbacks had team wide receivers ranking in the top 10 in fantasy points scored. Now, small sample size alert for sure. But of the 10 quarterbacks with 80 or more rush attempts over the last 2 seasons, 4 of them had wide receivers ranked in the top 10 as a team and wide receiver fantasy scoring. That's a 40% rate. And that rate was the highest of any of the subsets, which is kind of crazy to me, even when there's a small sample. And the same exact trend exists at tight end. We've got a smaller gap in overall ranking as we did before. We didn't see as dramatic numbers at tight end, but the definite runner group still had the lowest tight end scoring rank on average. However, these teams with high volume rushers at quarterback, they finished with top 10 tight end fantasy scores at just as high of a rate as the other 2 groups. So to put this all another way, because I know it's kind of hard to follow, over the last 2 years, we've seen this interesting separation. The averages all look pretty similar, but it's because there are haves and have-nots within that definite runner group. But then you look at the quarterbacks who are in that group, the quarterbacks who have been running the ball 80 plus times a season over the last 2 years. Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen, those are 3 of them. And then there's Daniel Jones, Justin Fields, Kyler Murray, and Marcus Mariota. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Kyler Murray are the 3 quarterbacks who've given us team wide receiver rankings in the top 10 in fantasy points scored over the last 2 years. The rest have largely been complete trash within that department. They've ranked on average 27th in wide receiver points scored. Now, at first, when I was analyzing this, I thought to myself, within this small sample, we may be seeing that a select number of quarterbacks are doing so much now for an offense. They're running the ball a ton, but they're also being so efficient through the air. So this data, this mobile quarterback data, just doesn't apply to them. That was my initial thought. But then I took another step back. The guys who have bucked this trend over the last 2 years are Allen, Hurts, and Murray, like I just said. What do those quarterbacks have in common? Stephon Diggs, Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, DeAndre Hopkins. This then led me down a completely new path with all this mobile quarterback stuff. What we've seen is that mobile quarterbacks tend to be a bad thing for all positions in fantasy football at a very, very high level. They're not good for wide receivers and tight ends, probably because of passing volume. And even though running backs might be more efficient, they're losing touchdown equity and they're generally seeing lower target shares when the quarterback is running the ball more. And those lower target shares are on lower passing volume. It's not a good combination. But then we still see the Eagles do what they did in 2022 with their wide receivers, or what Josh Allen's been able to do with the Bills. And then it hit me. If you look at those teams, you notice that one, maybe two positional groups are thriving, but one of them is not. The Eagles and the Bills in particular are great examples of this. The Eagles got great fantasy production from their wide receivers in 2022. They ranked 6th in the league in points scored at the position. Now, Dallas Goedert was good because he saw a huge target share. He was also injured, though. And that team actually ranked 19th in tight end points scored. And then as for the team's running backs, Miles Sanders was fine, but the whole group ranked 24th in fantasy points scored at the position. So one positional group looked really good for the Eagles. The other ones didn't look as good. And it was the exact same deal for Buffalo. Buffalo wideouts ranked 5th in fantasy points scored last year. But their running backs were 27th, their tight ends were 26th. It's almost like these mobile quarterbacks are still taking a chunk of their offense's fantasy points, even if one positional group is thriving. And that's exactly what the data shows. Let's shift our focus back to all of our data since 2011. And let's go back to our groups of non-rushing quarterback teams, semi-rushing quarterback teams, and definite rushing quarterback teams. When looking at the non-rushing quarterback teams, since 2011, 29% of them were able to give us two positional group rankings in the top 10 in fantasy points scored. So a team with a quarterback who ran the ball fewer than 40 times, they had two of a running back, wide receiver, or tight end positional group finishing in the top 10 in fantasy points scored. It could have been wide receivers and running backs. It could have been wide receivers and tight ends. It could have been running backs and tight ends. They had two positional groups ranking in the top 10. As I just noted, the Bills and Eagles failed to do that in 2022. They only had one positional group. So next is the semi-runner group. They had more than one positional group in the top 10 at a 19% rate. So that rate is now dropping. It dropped by about 10%. Now let's go to the definite rusher group. That group of quarterbacks had more than one top 10 positional group in fantasy points scored at a 2.3% rate. And there we have it. You see, there's not this specific formula that you have to use here. That if you're staring down a player on a team with a mobile quarterback during your draft, that you have to fade that player. Trends definitely tell us they won't perform as well. They're going to have a tougher time scoring fantasy points because their environment is not as good. But there's a lot more to it. You obviously have to look at the player himself first and foremost. I'll always tell you to do that. If he's talented, if he's good, then he has a chance to capture a large enough share of his offense. He can overcome his team situation. But if you're bullish on a certain positional group in an offense with a high volume rushing quarterback, chances are if you're right about that prediction, both of the other positions on that team are likely to struggle. Maybe not an individual player, because like I said, a player can capture a larger target share or a larger share of his offense. But you're absolutely going to need that for that player in order for him to thrive. Again, we've seen 44 seasons since 2011 where a quarterback ran the ball 80 or more times. Of those 44 seasons, just one of them featured a quarterback with multiple positional groups finishing in the top 10 in fantasy points scored. And guess what? That came from Kyler Murray in 2021. That season, Cardinals running backs were 9th in fantasy points scored. They barely got in the top 10. And guess what? Their wide receivers were also 9th. The bottom line here, you guys, is that mobile quarterbacks take away plays from an offense. When that quarterback decides to run, or where there's a play designed for him to run, all of the other dudes in that offense aren't touching the ball. And there's a finite number of plays that a team's going to run in a given game. A team can't run 100 plus plays over and over again. There's not enough time. So if some of those plays are going solely to the quarterback, then those plays aren't benefiting his teammates from a fantasy perspective. It's really that simple of a concept, but it's still a concept that you can exploit during your fantasy drafts. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Talk to you later in the week with the Mailbag Show.